Okay, I think we are good. A bit of a late start today, and for that I apologize. Let's see. It would probably help if I swapperated to the chat channel. There we go. Okay, that should probably do it. So, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Story Time Saturdays. I am your intrepid narrator, Fragath. Hmm. And today, I got a special treat for y'alls. Burning Chrome by William Gibson. I'm quite fond. Oh, I just realized that maybe it's BURN1NG CHR0ME, in which case, no, it's not. From 1986. It is not. It is, no, that is just this modern cover. Don't worry about it. Okay. So, this is Burning Chrome is a collection of short stories by the main man himself, the one of the grandfathers of cyberpunk in general, William Gibson. And it's got some pretty great stuff in it. It's got Johnny Mnemonic, which got adapted into a movie with Keanu Reeves. Movie is fun enough. It's not particularly it like there's a lot of stuff that's accurate to the original short story, but not all of it. And there are some visual text gimmicks in here I'm going to have to describe. Um, Actually, it does a pretty good job of describing them here, but there are some visual text gags that are done here in Johnny Mnemonic. And that one's not super long. That's only like 23 pages, so we should be able to get through that no problem. And then after that is kind of a Twilight Zoney short story called The Gernsback Continuum, which I'm quite fond of, um, because I'm a sort of a fan of what's the word I'm looking for? My just language centers lately have been completely shot. Retrofuturism. There we go. Thank you. I knew the word was there. uh, Retrofuturism, like so, or rocket punk, or the term that is coined here is ray gun gothic, um, sort of this Art Deco look. Um, we'll get there. We'll get to that. After that is sort of a post-apocalyptic tale. I don't know how long that one is. It has been a long time since I read these. Uh, so it's going to be kind of a refresher for me, but I've got a pretty good idea of what I want to do. I have mentioned in both my text and elsewhere. Oh, should I read the introductions? I don't know. I've mentioned and on my previous stream that I did that my work schedule is ramped way up, so I'm not going to be able to do very many of these streams. I'm going to try and at least do these Storytime Saturday streams because I have a lot of fun doing them. But scheduling conflicts right now are a bit of a killer. So doing most of my streaming stuff is going to be sort of a catch as catch can. Like if I magically get a day off, then I'll be able to do it. But I haven't been able to organize my own schedule super effectively in this regard to free up time. I am not going to read the introduction. Normally I would, and there is good stuff in here, but like the preface by Bruce Sterling is pretty rad. Um, and the source code and introduction by William Gibson is also pretty revealing. It kind of describes a lot about his creative process. I find William Gibson and his writing style and the way he writes extremely fascinating. He's a very fascinating individual himself. Um, really interesting, eclectic tastes. Kind of an obsession for certain kinds of jackets, apparently. A very, very interesting man. What always impresses the hell out of me with his books is how incredibly well the intimate understanding he seems to have of zeitgeist and zeitgeist meaning spirit of the times, and kind of understanding like how people are likely to utilize a given technology when it's presented to them, um, in like a couple of years, sort of thing. Now, stuff like Neuromancer, Count Zero, uh, and Mona Lisa Overdrive are kind of their own thing, which are kind of this what is that called, the Sprawl trilogy, um, like the three, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost in terms of William Gibson's cyberpunk literature, the Holy Trinity, pretty great. And then you have after that Virtual Light, whatever the second one is called, is that Idoru? And then I think it's All Tomorrow's Parties is the third one in that series. And that trilogy is also very good. That's kind of more like with each trilogy that he comes out with, um, it seems like he gets closer and closer and closer to predicting reality, sort of thing. He winds up in one of his like books from the last 20 years predicting remote controlled commercial UAVs using smartphones. He manages to predict that. He manages to predict augmented reality via smartphones, and this is like at least 5 years before that ever became a thing. So his predictive ability impresses the hell out of me. But then what's equally entertaining are the things that wind up being different, and those can be really fun. So I have rambled long enough. Let's get down to it. This will be Burning Chrome by William Gibson, and we're starting off with Johnny Mnemonic. That is Johnny, Johnnny, mnemonic. M as in Mary, N as in Nancy, E M as in Mary, O N as in Nancy, I C. Mnemonic. Johnny Mnemonic by William Gibson. I put the shotgun in an Adidas bag and patted it out with 4 pairs of tennis socks. Not my style at all, but that was what I was aiming for. If they think you're crude, go technical. If they think you're technical, go crude. I'm a very technical boy. So I decided to get as crude as possible. These days, though, you have to be pretty technical before you can even aspire to crude. Before you can even aspire to crudeness. I'd had to turn both these 12-gauge shells from brass stock on a lathe and then load them myself. I'd had to dig up an old microfiche with instructions for hand-loading cartridges. I'd had to build a lever-action press to seat the primers. All very tricky, but I knew they'd work. The meet was set for the drome at 2300, but I rode the tube 3 stops past the closest platform and walked back. Immaculate procedure. I checked myself out in the chrome siding of a coffee kiosk, your basic sharp-faced Caucasoid with a ruff of stiff, dark hair. The girls at Under the Knife were big on Sony Mao, and it was getting harder to keep them from adding the chic suggestion of epicanthic folds. It probably wouldn't fool Ralphie Face, but it might get me next to his table. The drome is a single narrow space with a bar down one side and tables along the other, thick with pimps and handlers and an arcane array of dealers. The Magnetic Dog Sisters were on the door that night, and I didn't relish trying to get out past them if things didn't work out. They were 2 meters tall and thin as greyhounds. One was black and the other white, but aside from that, they were as nearly identical as cosmetic surgery could make them. They'd been lovers for years and were bad news in a tussle. I was never quite sure which one had originally been male. Ralphie was sitting at his usual table, owing me a lot of money. I had hundreds of megabytes stashed in my head on an idiot savant basis. Information I had no conscious access to. Ralphie had left it there. He hadn't, however, come back for it. Only Ralphie could retrieve the data, with a code phrase of his own invention. I'm not cheap to begin with, but my overtime on storage is astronomical. And Ralphie had been very scarce. Then I'd heard that Ralphie Face had wanted to put out a contract on me. So I'd arranged to meet him in the Drome, but I'd arranged it as Edward Bax, clandestine importer, late of Rio and Peking. The Drome stank of biz, a metallic tang of nervous tension. Muscle boys scattered through the crowd were flexing stock parts at one another and trying on thin, cold grins, some of them so lost under superstructures of muscle graft that their outlines weren't really human. Pardon me, friends, just Eddie Bax here. Fast Eddie, the importer, with his professionally nondescript gym bag, and please ignore this slit just wide enough to admit his right hand. Ralphie wasn't alone. 80 kilos of blonde California beef perched alertly in the chair next to his, martial arts written all over him. Fast Eddie Bax was in the chair opposite them before the beef's hands were off the table. You black belt? I asked eagerly. He nodded, blue eyes running an automatic scanning pattern between my eyes and my hands. Me too, I said. Got mine here in the bag. And I shoved my hand through the slit and thumbed the safety off. Click. Double 12 gauge with the triggers wired together. That's a gun, Ralphie said, putting a plump restraining hand on his boy's taut blue nylon chest. Johnny has an antique firearm in his bag. So much for Edward Bax. I guess he'd always been Ralphie something or other, but he owed his acquired surname to a singular vanity. Built something like an overripe pear, he'd worn the once famous face of Christian White for 20 years. Christian White of the Aryan reggae band, Sony Mao to his generation, and final champion of race rock. I'm a whiz at trivia. Christian White. Classic pop face with a singer's high-definition muscles, chiseled cheekbones. Angelic in one light, handsomely depraved in another. But Ralphie's eyes lived behind that face, and they were small and cold and black. Please, he said, let's work this out like businessmen. His voice was marked by a horrible prehensile sincerity, and the corners of his beautiful Christian White mouth were always wet. Lewis here, nodding in the beef boy's direction, is a meatball. Lewis took this impassively, looking like something built from a kit. You aren't a meatball, Johnny. Sure I am, Ralphie. A nice meatball chock full of implants where you can store your dirty laundry while you go off shopping for people to kill me. From my end of this bag, Ralphie, it looks like you've got some explaining to do. It's this last batch of product, Johnny. He sighed deeply. In my role as a broker. Fence, I corrected. As broker, I'm usually very careful as to sources. You buy only from those who steal the best. Got it. He sighed again. I try, he said wearily, not to buy from fools. This time I'm afraid I've done that. Third sigh was the cue for Lewis to trigger the neural disruptor they'd taped under my side of the table. I put everything I had into curling the index finger of my right hand, but I no longer seemed to be connected to it. I could feel the metal of the gun and the foam pad tape I'd wrapped around the stubby grip, but my hands were cool wax, distant and inert. I was hoping Lewis was a true meatball, thick enough to go for the gym bag and snag my rigid trigger finger, but he wasn't. We've been very worried about you, Johnny. Very worried. You see, that's Yakuza property you have there. A fool took it from them, Johnny. A dead fool. Lewis giggled. It all made sense then, an ugly kind of sense, like bags of wet sand settling around my head. Killing wasn't Ralphie's style. Lewis wasn't even Ralphie's style. But he'd got himself stuck between the sons of the neon chrysanthemum and something that belonged to them, or more likely, something of theirs that belonged to someone else. Ralphie, of course, could use the code phrase to throw me into idiot savant, and I'd spill their hot program without remembering a single quarter tone. For a fence like Ralphie, that would ordinarily have been enough, but not for the Yakuza. The Yakuza would know about squids, for one thing, and they wouldn't want to worry about one lifting those dim and permanent traces of their program out of my head. I didn't know very much about squids, but I'd heard stories, and I made it a point never to repeat them to my clients. No, the Yakuza wouldn't like that. It looked too much like evidence. They hadn't got where they were by leaving evidence around. Or alive. Lewis was grinning. I think he was visualizing a point just behind my forehead and imagining how he could get there the hard way. "Hey," said a low voice, feminine, from somewhere behind my right shoulder. "You cowboys sure aren't having too lively a time." "Pack it, bitch," Lewis said, his tanned face very still. Oh, whoops. "Pack it, bitch," Lewis said, his tanned face very still. Ralphie looked blank. "Lighten up. You want to buy some good freebase?" She pulled up a chair and quickly sat before either of them could stop her. She was barely inside my fixed field of vision, a thin girl with mirrored glasses, her dark hair cut in a rough shag. She wore black leather, open over a t-shirt slashed diagonally with stripes of red and black. "8 thou a gram weight." Lewis snorted his exasperation and tried to slap her out of the chair. Somehow he didn't quite connect, and her hand came up and seemed to brush his wrist as it passed. Bright blood sprayed the table. He was clutching his wrist, white knuckle tight, blood trickling from between his fingers. But hadn't her hand been empty? He was going to need a tendon stapler. He stood up carefully, without bothering to push his chair back. The chair toppled backward, and he stepped out of my line of sight without a word. "He better get a medic to look at that," she said. "That's a nasty cut." "You have no idea," said Ralphie, suddenly sounding very tired, "the depths of shit you have just gotten yourself into." "No kidding? Mystery. I get real excited by mysteries. Like why your friend here's so quiet, frozen like. Or what this thing here is for." And she held up the little control unit that she'd somehow taken from Lewis. Ralphie looked ill. "You want maybe $250,000 to give me that and take a walk?" A fat hand came up to stroke his pale, lean face nervously. "What I want," she said, snapping her fingers so that the unit spun and glittered, "is work. A job. Your boy hurt his wrist, but a quarter'll do for a retainer." Ralphie let his breath out explosively and began to laugh, exposing teeth that hadn't been kept up to the Christian White standard. Then she turned the disruptor off. "2 million," I said. "My kind of man," she said, and laughed. "What's in the bag?" "A shotgun." Crude. It might have been a compliment. Ralphie said nothing at all. "Name's Millions. Molly Millions. You want to get out of here, boss? People are starting to stare." She stood up. She was wearing leather jeans the color of dried blood. And I saw for the first time that the mirrored lenses were surgical inlays, the silver rising smoothly from her high cheekbones, sealing her eyes in their sockets. I saw my new face twinned there. "I'm Johnny," I said. "We're taking Mr. Face with us." He was outside, waiting, looking like your standard tourist tech, in plastic zoris and a silly Hawaiian shirt printed with blow-ups of his firm's most popular microprocessor. A mild little guy, the kind most likely to wind up drunk on sake in a bar that puts out miniature rice crackers with seaweed garnish. He looked like the kind who sing the corporate anthem and cry, who shake hands endlessly with the bartender. And the pimps and the dealers would leave him alone, pegging him as innately conservative, not up for much, and careful with his credit when he was. The way I figured it later, they must have amputated part of his left thumb, somewhere behind the first joint, replacing it with a prosthetic tip, and cored the stump, fitting it with a spool and socket molded from one of the Ono Sendai diamond analogs. Then they'd carefully wound the spool with 3 meters of monomolecular filament. Molly got into some kind of exchange with the magnetic dog sisters, giving me a chance to usher Ralphie through the door with the gym bag pressed lightly against the base of his spine. She seemed to know them. I heard the black one laugh. I glanced up, out of some passing reflex, maybe because I've never got used to it, the soaring arcs of light and the shadows of the geodesics above them. Maybe that saved me. Ralphie kept walking, but I don't think he was trying to escape. I think he'd already given up. Probably he already had an idea of what we were up against. I looked back down in time to see him explode. Playback on full recall shows Ralphie stepping forward as the little text sidles out of nowhere, smiling. Just a suggestion of a bow, and his left thumb falls off. It's a conjuring trick. The thumb hangs, suspended. Mirrors? Wires? And Ralphie stops, his back to us, dark crescents of sweat under the armpits of his pale summer suit. He knows. He must have known. And then the joke shop thumb tip, heavy as lead, arcs out in a lightning yo-yo trick, and the invisible thread connecting it to the killer's hand passes laterally through Ralphie's skull, just above his eyebrows, whips up and descends, slicing the pear-shaped torso diagonally from shoulder to rib cage. Cuts so fine that no blood flows until synapses misfire and the first tremors surrender the body to gravity. Ralphie tumbled apart in a pink cloud of fluids, the 3 mismatched sections rolling forward onto the tiled pavement. In total silence. I brought the gym bag up, and my hand convulsed. The recoil nearly broke my wrist. It must have been raining. Ribbons of water cascaded from a ruptured geodesic and spattered on the tile behind us. We crouched in the narrow gap between a surgical boutique and an antique shop. She'd just edged one mirrored eye around the corner to report a single Volks module in front of the drome, red lights flashing. They were sweeping Ralphie up, asking questions. I was covered in scorched white fluff, the tennis socks. The gym bag was a ragged plastic cuff around my wrist. I don't see how the hell I missed him. 'Cause he's fast, so fast. She hugged her knees and rocked back and forth on her boot heels. His nervous system's jacked up. He's factory custom. She grinned and gave a little squeal of delight. I'm gonna get that boy tonight. He's the best, #1, top dollar, state of the art. What you're gonna get for this boy's 2 million is my ass out of here. Your boyfriend back there was mostly grown in a vat in Chiba City. He's a Yakuza assassin. Chiba. Yeah. See, Molly's been Chiba too. And she showed me her hands, fingers slightly spread. Her fingers were slender, tapered, very white against the polished burgundy nails. 10 blades snicked straight out from their recesses beneath her nails, each one a narrow double-edged scalpel in pale blue steel. I'd never spent much time in Night Town. Nobody there had anything to pay me to remember, and most of them had a lot they paid regularly to forget. Generations of sharpshooters had chipped away at the neon until the maintenance crews had given up. Even at noon, the arcs were soot black against faintest pearl. Where do you go when the world's wealthiest criminal order is feeling for you with calm, distant fingers? Where do you hide from the Yakuza, so powerful that it owns comsats and at least 3 shuttles? The Yakuza is a true multinational, like ITT and Ono Sendai. 50 years before I was born, the Yakuza had already absorbed the Triads, the Mafia, and the Union Course. Molly had an answer. You hide in the pit, in the lowest circle, where any outside influence generates swift, concentric ripples of raw menace. You hide in Nighttown. Better yet, you hide above Nighttown because the pit's inverted, and the bottom of its bowl touches the sky that Nighttown never sees, sweating under its own firmament of acrylic resin, up where the low techs crouch in the dark like gargoyles, black market cigarettes dangling from their lips. She had another answer, too. So, you're locked up good and tight, Johnny-san? No way to get that program without the password? She led me into the shadows that waited beyond the bright tube platform. The concrete walls were overlaid with graffiti, years of them twisting into a single meta-scrawl of rage and frustration. The stored data are fed in through a modified series of microsurgical contra-autism prostheses. I reeled off a numb version of my standard sales pitch. Client's code is stored in a special chip. Barring squids, which we in the trade don't like to talk about, there's no way to recover your phrase. Can't drug it out, cut it out, torture it. I don't know it, never did. Squids? Crawly things with arms? We emerged into a deserted street market. Shadowy figures watched us from across a makeshift square littered with fish heads and rotting fruit. Superconducting quantum interference detectors. Used them in the war to find submarines, suss out enemy cyber systems. Yeah? Navy stuff? From the war? Squid'll read that chip of yours? She stopped walking, and I felt her eyes on me behind those twin mirrors. Even the primitive models could measure a magnetic field a billionth the strength of a geomagnetic force. It's like pulling a whisper out of a cheering stadium. Cops can do that already with parabolic microphones and lasers. But your data's still secure. Pride in profession. No government will let their cops have squids, not even the security heavies. Too much chance of interdepartmental funnies. They're too likely to Watergate you. Navy stuff, she said, and her grin gleamed in the shadows. Navy stuff. I got a friend down here who is in the Navy. Name's Jones. I think you'd better meet him. He's a junkie, though. So we'll have to take him something. A junkie? A dolphin. He was more than a dolphin, but from another dolphin's point of view, he might have seemed like something less. I watched him swirling sluggishly in his galvanized tank. Water slopped over the side, wetting my shoes. He was surplus from the last war. A cyborg. He rose out of the water, showing us the crusted plates along his sides, a kind of visual pun, his grace nearly lost under articulated armor, clumsy and prehistoric. Twin deformities on either side of his skull had been engineered to house sensor units. Silver lesions gleamed on exposed sections of his gray-white hide. Molly whistled. Jones thrashed his tail, and more water cascaded down the side of the tank. What is this place? I peered at vague shapes in the dark, rusting chain link and things under tarps. Above the tank hung a clumsy wooden framework, crossed and recrossed by rows of dusty Christmas lights. Funland, zoo and carnival rides, talk with the war whale, all that. Some whale Jones is. Jones reared again and fixed me with a sad and ancient eye. How's he talk? Suddenly I was anxious to go. That's the catch. Say hi, Jones. And all the bulbs lit simultaneously. They were flashing red, white, and blue. RWB, 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 and that repeats 5 times. In a box pattern.
Good with symbols, see, but the code's restricted. In the Navy, they had him wired to an audiovisual display. She drew the narrow package from a jacket pocket. Pure shit, Jones. Want it? He froze in the water and started to sink. I felt a strange panic, remembering that he wasn't a fish, that he could drown. We want the keys to Johnny's bank, Jones. We want it fast. The lights flickered, died. Go for it, Jones. And then you have a bunch of B's, which are the blue, arranged in a T or a cross. Blue bulbs, cruciform, darkness. Pure, it's clean. Come on, Jones. And then you have an entire box of W's, which are the whites. White sodium glare washed her features, stark monochrome, shadows cleaving from her cheekbones. Then you have a bunch of R's or reds in the shape of a swastika. The arms of the red swastika were twisted in her silver glasses. Give it to him, I said. We've got it. Ralphie face, no imagination. Jones heaved half his armored bulk over the edge of his tank, and I thought the metal would give way. Molly stabbed him overhand with the syrette, driving the needle between two plates. Propellant hissed. Patterns of light exploded, spasming across the frame and then fading to black. We left him drifting, rolling languorously in the dark water. Maybe he was dreaming of his war in the Pacific, of the cyber mines he'd swept, nosing gently into their circuitry with the squid he'd used to pick Ralphie's pathetic password from the chip buried in my head. I can see them slipping up when he was demobbed, letting him out of the Navy with that gear intact, but how does a cybernetic dolphin get wired to smack? The war, she said. They all were. Navy did it. How else you get 'em working for you? I'm not sure this profile's is good business, the pirate said, angling for better money. Target specs on a comsat that isn't in the book. Waste my time and you won't profile at all, said Molly, leaning across his scarred plastic desk to prod him with her forefinger. So maybe you want to buy your microwave somewhere else? He was a tough kid beneath his Mao job, a night a night a night towner, sorry. A night towner by birth, probably. Her hand blurred down the front of his jacket, completely severing a lapel without even rumpling the fabric. So we got a deal or not? Deal, he said, staring at his ruined lapel with what he must have hoped was only polite interest. Deal. While I checked the two recorders we'd bought, she extracted the slip of paper I'd given her from the zippered wrist pocket of her jacket. She unfolded it and read silently, moving her lips. She shrugged. This is it? Shoot, I said, punching the record studs of the two decks simultaneously. Christian White, she recited, and his Aryan reggae band. Faithful Ralphie, a fan to his dying day. Transition to idiot savant mode is always less abrupt than I expect it to be. The pirate broadcaster's front was a failing travel agency in a pastel cube that boasted a desk, three chairs, and a faded poster of a Swiss orbital spa. A pair of toy birds with blown glass bodies and tin legs were sipping monotonously from a styrofoam cup of water on a ledge beside Molly's shoulder. As I phased into mode, they accelerated gradually until their day-glow feathered crowns became solid arcs of color. The LEDs that told seconds on the plastic wall clock had become meaningless pulsing grids, and Molly and the Mao-faced boy grew hazy, their arms blurring occasionally in insect-quick ghosts of gesture. And then it all faded to cool gray static and an endless tone poem in an artificial language. I sat and sang Dead Ralphie's Stolen Program for 3 hours.
The mall runs 40 kilometers from end to end, a ragged overlap of fuller domes roofing what was once a suburban artery. If they turn off the arcs on a clear day, a gray approximation of sunlight filters through layers of acrylic, a view like the prison sketches of Giovanni Piranesi. The three southernmost kilometers roof Nighttown. Nighttown pays no taxes, no utilities. The neon arcs are dead, and the geodesics have been smoked black by decades of cooking fires. In the nearly total darkness of a Nighttown noon, who notices a few dozen mad children lost in the rafters? We'd been climbing for 2 hours, up concrete stairs and steel ladders with perforated rungs, past abandoned gantries and dust-covered tools. We'd started in what looked like a disused maintenance yard, stacked with triangular roofing segments. Everything there had been covered with that same uniform layer of spray bomb graffiti. Gang names, initials, dates back to the turn of the century. The graffiti followed us up, gradually thinning until a single name was repeated at intervals. Low Tech. In dripping black capitals. Who's Low Tech? Not us, boss. She climbed a shivering aluminum ladder and vanished through a hole in a sheet of corrugated plastic. Low technique, low technology. The plastic muffled her voice. I followed her up, nursing my aching wrist. Low techs, they'd think that shotgun trick of yours was effete. An hour later, I dragged myself up through another hole, this one sawed crookedly in a sagging sheet of plywood, and met my first low tech. It's okay, Molly said, her hand brushing my shoulder. It's just Dog. Hey, Dog. In the narrow beam of her taped flash, he regarded us with his one eye and slowly extruded a thick length of grayish tongue, licking huge canines. I wondered how they wrote off tooth bud transplants from Dobermans as low technology. Immunosuppressives don't exactly grow on trees. Ball. Dental augmentation impeded his speech. A string of saliva dangled from his twisted lower lip. How you comin'? Long time. He might have been 15, but the fangs and a bright mosaic of scars combined with the gaping socket to present a mask of total bestiality. It had taken time and a certain kind of creativity to assemble that face, and his posture told me he enjoyed living behind it. He wore a pair of decaying jeans, black with grime and shiny along the creases. His chest and feet were bare. He did something with his mouth that approximated a grin. Being followed, you. Far off, down in Nighttown, a water vendor cried his trade. Strings jumpin', Dog? She swung her flash to the side, and I saw thin cords tied to eye bolts, cords that ran to the edge and vanished. Kill the fucking light! She snapped it off. How come the one who's following you has got no light? Doesn't need it. That one's bad news, Dog. Your sentries gave him a tumble. They'll give him a. Your sentries give him a tumble. They'll come home in easy to carry sections. This a friend, Maul? He sounded uneasy. I heard his feet shift on the worn plywood. No, but he's mine. And this one, slapping my shoulder, he's a friend. Got that? Sure, he said, without much enthusiasm, padding to the platform's edge where the eye bolts were. He began to pluck out some kind of message on the taut cords. Nighttown spread beneath us like a toy village for rats. Tiny windows showed candlelight, with only a few harsh, bright squares lit by battery lanterns and carbide lamps. I imagined the old men at their endless game of dominoes, under warm, fat drops of water that fell from wet wash hung out on poles between the plywood shanties. I tried to imagine him climbing patiently up through the darkness in his zoris and ugly tourist shirt, bland and unhurried. How was he tracking us? Good, said Molly. He smells us. Smoke? Dog dragged a crumpled pack from his pocket and prized out a flattened cigarette. I squinted at the trademark while he lit it for me with a kitchen match. Yehawan Filters, Beijing Cigarette Factory. I decided that the low-techs were black marketeers. Dog and Molly went back to their argument, which seemed to revolve around Molly's desire to use some particular piece of low-tech real estate. I've done you a lot of favors, man. I want that floor, and I want the music. You're not low-tech. This must have been going on for the better part of a twisted kilometer, Dog leading us along swaying catwalks and up rope ladders. The low-techs leach their webs and huddling places to the city's fabric with thick gobs of epoxy and sleep above the abyss in mesh hammocks. Their country is so attenuated that in places it consists of little more than holds for hands and feet, sawed into geodesic struts. The killing floor, she called it. Scrambling after her, my new Eddie Bax shoes slipping on worn metal and damp plywood, I wondered how it could be any more lethal than the rest of the territory. At the same time, I sensed that Dog's protests were ritual, and that she already expected to get whatever it was she wanted. Somewhere beneath us, Jones would be circling his tank, feeling the first twinges of junk sickness. The police would be boring the Drome regulars with questions about Ralphie. What did he do? Who was he with before he stepped outside? And the Yakuza would be settling its ghostly bulk over the city's databanks, probing for faint images of me reflected in numbered accounts, securities transactions, bills for utilities. We're an information economy. They teach you that in school. What they don't tell you is that it's impossible to move, to live, to operate at any level without leaving traces, bits, seemingly meaningless fragments of personal information. Fragments that can be retrieved, amplified. But by now the pirate would have shuttled our message into line for black box transmission to the Yakuza ComSat. A simple message. Call off the dogs or we wideband your program. The program. I had no idea what it contained. I still don't. I only sing the song with zero comprehension. It was probably research data, the Yakuza being given to advanced forms of industrial espionage. A genteel business, stealing from Ono Sendai as a matter of course, and politely holding their data for ransom, threatening to blunt the conglomerate's research edge by making the product public. But why couldn't any number play? Wouldn't they be happier with something to sell back to Ono Sendai? Happier than they'd be with one dead Johnny from Memory Lane? Their program was on its way to an address in Sydney, to a place that held letters for clients and didn't ask questions once you'd paid a small retainer. Fourth class surface mail. I'd erased most of the other copy and recorded our message in the resulting gap, leaving just enough of the program to identify it as the real thing. My wrist hurt. I wanted to stop, to lie down, to sleep. I knew that I'd lose my grip and fall soon, knew that the sharp black shoes that I'd bought for my evening as Eddie Bax would lose their purchase and carry me down to Nighttown. But he rose in my mind like a cheap religious hologram, glowing, the enlarged chip on his Hawaiian shirt looming like a reconnaissance shot of some doomed urban nucleus. So I followed Dog and Molly through low-tech heaven, jury-rigged and jerry-built from scraps that even Nighttown didn't want. The killing floor was 8 meters on a side. A giant had threaded steel cable back and forth through a junkyard and drawn it all taut. It creaked when it moved, and it moved constantly, swaying and bucking as the gathering low-techs arranged themselves on the shelf of plywood surrounding it. The wood was silver with age, polished with long use, and deeply etched with initials, threats, declarations of passion. This was suspended from a separate set of cables, which lost themselves in darkness beyond the raw white glare of the two ancient floods suspended above the floor. A girl with teeth like dogs hit the floor on all fours. Her breasts were tattooed with indigo spirals. Then she was across the floor, laughing, grappling with a boy who was drinking dark liquid from a liter flask. Low-tech fashion ran to scars and tattoos. And teeth. The electricity they were tapping to light the killing floor seemed to be an exception to their overall aesthetic, made in the name of ritual, sport, art. I didn't know, but I could see that the floor was something special. That's floor with a capital F. It had the look of having been assembled over generations. I held the useless shotgun under my jacket. Its hardness and heft were comforting, even though I had no more shells. And it came to me that I had no idea at all of what was really happening, or of what was supposed to happen. And that was the nature of my game, because I'd spent most of my life as a blind receptacle to be filled with other people's knowledge and then drained, spouting synthetic languages I'd never understand. A very technical boy, sure. And then I noticed just how quiet the Low-Techs had become. He was there, at the edge of the light, taking in the killing floor and the gallery of silent Low-Techs with a tourist's calm. And as our eyes met for the first time with mutual recognition, a memory clicked into place for me of Paris and the long Mercedes electrics gliding through the rain to Notre Dame, mobile greenhouses, Japanese faces behind the glass, and 100 Nikons rising in blind phototropism, flowers of steel and crystal. Behind his eyes, as they found me, those same shutters whirring. I looked for Molly Millions, but she was gone. The Low-Techs parted to let him step up onto the bench. He bowed, smiling, and stepped smoothly out of his sandals, leaving them side by side, perfectly aligned, and then he stepped down onto the killing floor. He came for me, across that shifting trampoline of scrap, as easily as any tourist padding across synthetic pile in any featureless hotel. Molly hit the floor, moving. The floor screamed. It was mic'd and amplified, with pickups riding the four fat coil springs at the corners and contact mics taped at random to rusting machine fragments. Somewhere the Low-Techs had an amp and a synthesizer, and now I made out the shapes of speakers overhead, above the cruel white floods. A drum beat began, electronic, like an amplified heart, steady as a metronome. She'd removed her leather jacket and boots. Her t-shirt was sleeveless, faint telltales of Chiba City circuitry traced along her thin arms. Her leather jeans gleamed under the floods. She began to dance. She flexed her knees, white feet tensed on a flattened gas tank, and the killing floor began to heave in response. The sound it made was like a world ending, like the wires that hold heaven snapping and coiling across the sky. He rode with it for a few heartbeats, and then he moved, judging the movement of the floor perfectly, like a man stepping from one flat stone to another in an ornamental garden. He pulled the tip from his thumb with the grace of a man at ease with social gesture and flung it at her. Under the floods, the filament was a refracting thread of rainbow. She threw herself flat and rolled, jackknifing up as the molecule whipped past, steel claws snapping into the light in what must have been an automatic rictus of defense. The drum pulse quickened, and she bounced with it, her dark hair wild around the blank. Oh my gosh, let's try that again. Some of these sentences, man, are killer. The drum pulse quickened, and she bounced with it, her dark hair wild around the blank silver lenses, her mouth thin, lips taut with concentration. The killing floor boomed and roared, and the Low-Techs were screaming their excitement. He retracted the filament to a whirling meter-wide circle of ghostly polychrome and spun it in front of him, thumbless hand held level with his sternum. A shield. And Molly seemed to let something go, something inside, and that was the real start of her mad dog dance. She jumped, twisting, lunging sideways, landing with both feet on an alloy engine block wired directly to one of the coil springs. I cupped my hands over my ears and knelt in a vertigo of sound, thinking floor and benches were on their way down, down into Nighttown, and I saw us tearing through the shanties, the wet wash, exploding on the tiles like rotten fruit. But the cables held, and the killing floor rose and fell like a crazy metal sea, and Molly danced on it. And at the end, just before he made his final cast with the filament, I saw something in his face, an expression that didn't seem to belong there. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't anger. I think it was disbelief, stunned incomprehension mingled with pure aesthetic revulsion at what he was seeing, hearing, and what was happening to him. He retracted the whirling filament, the ghost disc shrinking to the size of a dinner plate as he whipped his arm above his head and brought it down, the thumb tip curving out for Molly like a live thing. The floor carried her down, the molecule passing just above her head. The floor whiplashed, lifting him up into the path of the taut molecule. It should have passed harmlessly over his head and been withdrawn into its diamond hard socket. It took his hand off just behind the wrist. There was a gap in the floor in front of him, and he went through it like a diver, with a strange deliberate grace, a defeated kamikaze on his way down to Nighttown. Partly, I think, he took the dive to buy himself a few seconds of the dignity of silence. She'd killed him with culture shock. The low-techs roared, but someone shut the amplifier off, and Molly rode the killing floor into silence, hanging on now, her face white and blank, until the pitching slowed and there was only a faint pinging of tortured metal and the grating of rust on rust. We searched the floor for the severed hand, but we never found it. All we found was a graceful curve in one piece of rusted steel, where the molecule went through. Its edge was bright as new chrome. We never learned whether the Yakuza had accepted our terms, or even whether they got our message. As far as I know, their program is still waiting for Eddie Bax on a shelf in the back room of a gift shop on the third level of Sydney's Central 5. Probably they sold the original back to Ono Sendai months ago. But maybe they did get the Pirates broadcast, because nobody's come looking for me yet, and it's been nearly a year. If they do come, they'll have a long climb up through the dark, past dog sentries, and I don't look much like Eddie Bax these days. I let Molly take care of that with a local anesthetic. And my new teeth have almost grown in. I decided to stay up here. When I looked out across the killing floor, before he came, I saw how hollow I was, and I knew I was sick of being a bucket. So now I climb down and visit Jones almost every night. We're partners now, Jones and I, and Molly Millions, too. Molly handles our business in the drome. Jones is still in Funland, but he has a bigger tank, with fresh seawater trucked in once a week. And he has his junk when he needs it. He still talks to the kids with his frame of lights, but he talks to me on a new display unit in a shed that I rent there, a better unit than the one he used in the Navy. And we're all making good money, better money than I made before, because Jones's squid can read the traces of anything that anyone ever stored in me, and he gives it to me on the display unit in languages I can understand. So we're learning a lot about all my former clients. And one day I'll have a surgeon dig out all the sick. Let's try that again. And one day I'll have a surgeon dig all the silicon out of my amygdalae, and I'll live with my own memories and nobody else's, the way other people do. But not for a while. In the meantime, it's really okay up here, way up in the dark, smoking a Chinese filter tip and listening to the condensation that drips from the geodesics. Real quiet up here, unless a pair of low-techs decide to dance on the killing floor. It's educational, too. With Jones to help me figure things out, I'm getting to be the most technical boy in town. And that was Johnny Mnemonic by William Gibson. Sick. Molly Millions is awesome, by the way. She's a great recurring character. She's kind of a centerpiece of one of the centerpieces of neuromancer. I don't remember if she shows up in Count Zero. I don't think she does. And then Mona Lisa Overdrive. She's basically the lead protagonist. She's great. She's a ton of fun. Her character arc is also totally spectacular. She goes from being like hired muscle to ascended higher muscle to being like a multinational corp worker. It's pretty great, as well as hired muscle. She's good at that. She does what she does. She's fun. Um, this next one is kind of like a Twilight Zone type thing. I would compare it to a Twilight Zone episode. Kind of a nightmare in its own way. What time is it? Yeah, we've got time. I can at least get this one done. I might be able to do fragments of a hologram rose as well, because that's only like, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages. Yeah, it's short. But we'll see. So this next one is the Gernsback Continuum. One thing you'll probably have noticed is that Gibson does incredibly long, absurdly detailed sentences. Like the amount of detail describing the scene is completely insane. Like to the point of excess. It's crazy, but it gets you right in there. You can feel it. Like it just like you can feel it pouring out of you, pouring off of you, just dripping on your skin. It's crazy. Incredibly intricate. Very well visualized, and then translated to a written format. Alrighty, give me a second. I'm gonna take a sip of tea here. Tea. Ah, crunchy. The Gernsback Continuum by William Gibson. Mercifully, the whole thing is starting to fade, to become an episode. When I do still catch the odd glimpse, it's peripheral, mere fragments of Mad Dr. Chrome confining themselves to the corner of the eye. There was that flying wing liner over San Francisco last week, but it was almost translucent. And the shark fin roadsters have gotten scarcer, and freeways discreetly avoid unfolding themselves into the gleaming 80-lane monsters I was forced to drive last month in my rented Toyota. And I know that none of it will follow me to New York. My vision is narrowing to a single wavelength of probability. I've worked hard for that. Television helped a lot. I suppose it started in London, in that bogus Greek taverna in Battersea Park Road, with lunch on Cohen's corporate tab. Dead steam table food, and it took them 30 minutes to find an ice bucket for the Retsina, sorry. Cohen works for Barris Watford, who publish big, trendy trade paperbacks, illustrated histories of the neon sign, the pinball machine, the wind-up toys of occupied Japan. I'd gone over to shoot a series of shoe ads. California girls with tanned legs and frisky day-glow jogging shoes had capered for me down the escalators of St. John's Wood and across the platforms of Tooting Bec. A lean and hungry young agency had decided that the mystery of London transport would sell waffle-tread nylon runners. They decide. I shoot. And Cohen, whom I knew vaguely from the old days in New York, had invited me to lunch the day before I was due out of Heathrow. He brought along a very fashionably dressed young woman named Dialta Downs, who is virtually chinless and evidently a noted pop art historian. In retrospect, I see her walking in beside Cohen under a floating neon sign that flashes "This way lies madness" in huge sans serif capitals. Cohen introduced us and explained that Dialta was the prime mover behind the latest Barris Watford project, an illustrated history of what she called American streamlined moderne. Cohen called it Ray Gun Gothic. Their working title was The Airstream Futuropolis, the Tomorrow That Never Was. There's a British obsession with the more baroque elements of American pop culture, something like the weird cowboys and Indians fetish of the West Germans, or the aberrant French hunger for old Jerry Lewis films. In D'Alta Downs, this manifested itself in a mania for a uniquely American form of architecture that most Americans are scarcely aware of. At first, I wasn't sure what she was talking about, but gradually it began to dawn on me. I found myself remembering Sunday morning television in the 50s. Sometimes they'd run old, eroded newsreels as filler on the local station. You'd sit there with a peanut butter sandwich and a glass of milk, and a static ridden Hollywood baritone would tell you there was a flying car in your future. And three Detroit engineers would putter around with this big old Nash with wings, and you'd see it rumbling furiously down some deserted Michigan runway. You never actually saw it take off, but it flew away to D'Alta Downs' Never Never Land, true home of a generation of completely uninhibited technophiles. She was talking about those odds and ends of futuristic 30s and 40s architecture you pass daily in American cities without noticing. The movie marquees ribbed to radiate some mysterious energy, the dime stores faced with fluted aluminum, the chrome tube chairs gathering dust in the lobbies of transient hotels. She saw these things as segments of a dream world, abandoned in the uncaring present. She wanted me to photograph them for her. The 30s had seen the first generation of American industrial designers. Until the 30s, all pencil sharpeners had looked like pencil sharpeners, your basic Victorian mechanism, perhaps with a curlicue of decorative trim. After the advent of the designers, some pencil sharpeners looked as though they'd been put together in wind tunnels. For the most part, the change was only skin deep. Under the streamlined chrome shell, you'd find the same Victorian mechanism, which made a certain kind of sense because the most successful American designers had been recruited from the ranks of Broadway theater designers. It was all a stage set, a series of elaborate props for playing at living in the future. Over coffee, Cohen produced a fat manila envelope full of glossies. I saw the winged statues that guard the Hoover Dam, 40-foot concrete hood ornaments leaning steadfastly into an imaginary hurricane. I saw a dozen shots of Frank Lloyd Wright's Johnson's Wax Building, juxtaposed with the covers of old Amazing Stories pulps by an artist named Frank R. Paul. The employees of Johnson's Wax must have felt as though they were walking into one of Paul's spray paint pulp utopias. Wright's building looked as though it had been designed for people who wore white togas and lucite sandals. I hesitated over one sketch of a particularly grandiose prop-driven airliner, all wing, like a fat symmetrical boomerang with windows in unlikely places. Labeled arrows indicated the locations of the grand ballroom and two squash courts. It was dated 1936. This thing couldn't have flown. I looked at D'Alta Downs. Oh no, quite impossible, even with those 12 giant props. But they loved the look, don't you see? New York to London in less than 2 days. First class dining rooms, private cabins, sun decks, dancing to jazz in the evening. The designers were populists, you see. They were trying to give the public what it wanted. What the public wanted was the future. I'd been in Burbank for 3 days, trying to suffuse a really dull looking rocker with charisma, when I got the package from Cohen. It is possible to photograph what isn't there. It's damned hard to do, and consequently a very marketable talent. While I'm not bad at it, I'm not exactly the best either, and this poor guy strained my Nikon's credibility. I got out, depressed because I do like to do a good job, but not totally depressed because I did make sure I'd gotten the check for the job, and I decided to restore myself with the sublime artiness of the Barris Watford assignment. Cohen had sent me some books on 30s design, more photos of streamlined buildings, and a list of D'Alta Downs' 50 favorite examples of the style in California. Architectural photography can involve a lot of waiting. The building becomes a kind of sundial, while you wait for a shadow to crawl away from a detail you want, or for the mass and balance of the structure to reveal itself in a certain way. While I was waiting, I thought myself in D'Alta Downs' America. When I isolated a few of the factory buildings on the ground glass of the Hasselblad, they came across with a kind of sinister totalitarian dignity, like the stadiums Albert Speer built for Hitler. But the rest of it was relentlessly tacky, ephemeral stuff extruded by the collective American subconscious of the 30s, tending mostly to survive along depressing strips lined with dusty motels, mattress wholesalers, and small used car lots. I went for gas. I went for the gas stations in a big way. During the high points of the Downs age, they put Ming the Merciless in charge of designing the California gas stations. Favoring the architecture of his native Mongo, he cruised up and down the coast, erecting ray gun emplacements in white stucco. Lots of them featured superfluous central towers ringed with those strange radiator flanges that were a signature motif of the style, and made them look as though they might generate potent bursts of raw technological enthusiasm, if you could if you could only find the switch that turned them on. I shot one in San Jose an hour before the bulldozers arrived and drove right through the structure. This is hard. I shot one in the I shot one in San Jose an hour before the bulldozers arrived and drove straight through the structural truth of plaster and lathing and cheap concrete. Think of it, Downs had said it had ugh. I swear these are not meant to be read aloud. And if you can read these aloud without stopping and stuttering, whoo boy, you either are doing a killer editing job or god damn you have talent that I don't. Think of it, D'Alta Downs had said, as a kind of alternate America, a 1980 that never happened, an architecture of broken dreams. And that was my frame of mind as I made the stations of her convoluted socio-architectural cross in my red Toyota. As I gradually tuned in to her image of a shadowy America that wasn't, of Coca-Cola plants like beached submarines, and fifth-run movie houses like the temples of some lost sect that had worshipped blue mirrors and geometry. And as I moved among these secret ruins, I found myself wondering what the inhabitants of that lost future would think of the world I lived in. The 30s dreamed white marble and slipstream chrome, immortal crystal and burnished bronze, but the rockets on the covers of the Gernsback pulps had fallen on London in the dead of night, screaming. After the war, everyone had a car, no wings for it, and the promised superhighway to drive it down, so that the sky itself darkened, and the fumes ate the marble and pitted the miracle crystal. And one day, on the outskirts of Bolinas, when I was setting up to shoot a particularly lavish example of Ming's martial architecture, I penetrated a fine membrane, a membrane of probability. Ever so gently, I went over the edge and looked up to see a 12-engined thing like a bloated boomerang, all wing, thrumming its way east with an elephantine grace, so low that I could count the rivets in its dull silver skin, and hear, maybe, the echo of jazz. I took it to Kin. Merv Kin, freelance journalist with an extensive line in Texas pterodactyls, redneck UFO contactees, Bush League Loch Ness monsters, and the top 10 conspiracy theories in the lunar reaches of the American mass mind. It's good, said Kin, polishing his yellow Polaroid shooting glasses on the hem of his Hawaiian shirt, but it's not but it's not mental, lacks the true quill. But I saw it, Mervyn. We were seated poolside in brilliant Arizona sunlight.
He was in Tucson waiting for a group of retired Las Vegas civil servants whose leader received messages from them on her microwave oven. I'd driven all night and was feeling it.
Of course you did. Of course you saw it. You've read my stuff. Haven't you grasped my blanket solution to the UFO problem? It's simple, plain and country simple. People,
He settled the glasses carefully on his long hawk nose and fixed me with his best basilisk glare.
see things. People see these things. Nothing's there, but people see them anyway. Because they need to, probably. You've read Jung. You should know the score. In your case, it's so obvious. You admit that you were thinking about this crackpot architecture, having fantasies. Look, I'm sure you've taken your share of drugs, right? How many people survived the 60s in California without having the odd hallucination? All those nights when you discovered that whole armies of Disney technicians had been employed to weave animated holograms of Egyptian hieroglyphs into the fabric of your jeans, say, or the times when. But it wasn't like that. Of course not. It wasn't like that at all. It was in a setting of clear reality, right? Everything normal. And then there's the monster, the mandala, the neon cigar. Or in your case, a giant Tom Swift airplane. It happens all the time. You aren't even crazy. You know that, don't you? He fished a beer out of the battered foam cooler beside his deck chair. Last week I was in Virginia, Grayson County. I interviewed a 16-year-old girl who'd been assaulted by a barhead.
A what?
A bearhead. A severed head of a bear. This barhead, see, was floating around on its own little flying saucer. Looked kind of like the hubcaps on Cousin Wayne's vintage caddy. Had red glowing eyes like two cigar stubs and telescoping chrome antennas poking up behind its ears. He burped.
It assaulted her? How?
You don't want to know. You're obviously impressionable.
It was cold. He lapsed into his bad southern accent. And metallic.
It made electronic noises. Now that is the real thing, the straight goods from the mass unconscious, friend. That little girl is a witch. There's just no place for her to function in this society. She'd have seen the devil if she hadn't been brought up on the Bionic Man and all those Star Trek reruns. She is clued into the main vein. And she knows that it happened to her. I got out 10 minutes before the heavy UFO boys showed up with the polygraph.
I must have looked pained because he set his beer down carefully beside the cooler and sat up.
If you want a classier explanation, I'd say you saw a semiotic ghost. All these contactee stories, for instance, are framed in a kind of sci fi imagery that permeates our culture. I could buy aliens, but not aliens that look like 50s comic art. The semiotic phantoms, bits of deep cultural imagery that have split off and taken on a life of their own, like the Jules Verne airships that those old Kansas farmers were always seeing. But you saw a different kind of ghost, that's all. That plane was part of the mass unconscious once. You picked up on that somehow. The important thing is not to worry about it.
I did worry about it, though. Kin combed his thinning blond hair and went off to hear what they had had to say over the radar range lately, and I drew the curtains in my room and lay down in air-conditioned darkness to worry about it. I was still worrying about it when I woke up. Kin had left a note on my door. He was flying up north in a chartered plane to check out a cattle mutilation rumor. Muties, he called them, another of his journalistic specialties. I had a meal, showered, took a crumbling diet pill that had been kicking around in the bottom of my shaving kit for 3 years, and headed back to Los Angeles. The speed limited my vision to the tunnel of the Toyota's headlights. The body could drive, I told myself, while the mind maintained. Maintained and stayed away from the weird peripheral window dressing of amphetamine and exhaustion, the spectral luminous vegetation that grows out of the corners of the mind's eye along late night highways. But the mind had its own ideas, and Kin's opinion of what I was already thinking of as my sighting rattled endlessly through my head in a tight, lopsided orbit. Semiotic ghosts, fragments of the mass dream, whirling past in the wind of my passage. Somehow this feedback loop aggravated the diet pill, and the speed vegetation along the road began to assume the colors of infrared satellite images, glowing shreds blown apart in the Toyota's slipstream. I pulled over, then, and a half dozen aluminum beer cans winked good night as I killed the headlights. I wondered what time it was in London, and tried to imagine D'Alta Downs having breakfast in her Hampstead flat, surrounded by streamlined chrome figurines and books on American culture. Desert nights in that country are enormous. The moon is closer. I watched the moon for a long time and decided that Kin was right. The main thing was not to worry. All across the continent, daily, people who were more normal than I'd ever aspired to be saw giant birds, big feet, flying oil refineries. They kept Kin busy and solvent. Why should I be upset by a glimpse of the 1930s pop imagination loose over Bolinas? I decided to go to sleep, with nothing worse to worry about than rattlesnakes and cannibal hippies, safe amid the friendly roadside garbage of my own familiar continuum. In the morning I'd drive down to Nogales and photograph the old brothels, something I'd intended to do for years. The diet pill had given up. The light woke me, and then the voices. The light came from somewhere behind me and through shifting shadows inside the car. The voices were calm, indistinct, male and female, engaged in conversation. My neck was stiff and my eyeballs felt gritty in their sockets. My leg had gone to sleep, pressed against the steering wheel. I fumbled for my glasses in the pocket of my work shirt and finally got them on. Then I looked behind me and saw the city. The books on 30s design were in the trunk. One of them contained sketches of an idealized city that drew on metropolis and things to come, but squared everything, soaring up through an architect's perfect clouds to Zeppelin docks and mad neon spires. That city was a scale model of the one that rose behind me. Spire stood on spire in gleaming ziggurat steps that climbed to a central golden temple tower, ringed with the crazy radiator flanges of the Mongo gas stations. You could hide the Empire State Building in the smallest of those towers. Roads of crystal soared between the spires, crossed and recrossed by smooth silver shapes like beads of running mercury. The air was thick with ships, giant wing liners, little darting silver things. Sometimes one of the quicksilver shapes from the sky bridges rose gracefully into the air and flew up to join the dance. Mile-long blimps, hovering dragonfly things that were gyrocopters. I closed my eyes tight and swung around in the seat. When I opened them, I willed myself to see the mileage meter, the pale road dust on the black plastic dashboard, the overflowing ashtray. Amphetamine psychosis, I said. I opened my eyes. The dash was still there, the dust, the crushed filter tips. Very carefully, without moving my head, I turned the headlights on. And saw them. They were blonde. They were standing beside their car, an aluminum avocado with a central shark fin rudder jutting up from its spine, and smooth black tires like a child's toy. He had his arm around her waist and was gesturing toward the city. They were both in white, loose clothing, bare legs, spotless white sun shoes. Neither of them seemed aware of the beams of my headlights. He was saying something wise and strong, and she was nodding, and suddenly I was frightened. Frightened in an entirely different way. Sanity had ceased to be an issue. I knew, somehow, that the city behind me was Tucson, a dream Tucson thrown up out of the collective yearning of an era. That it was real, entirely real. but the couple in front of me lived in it, and they frightened me. They were the children of Dialta Downs' 80s that wasn't. They were heirs to the dream. They were white, blonde, and they probably had blue eyes. They were American. Dialta had said that the future had come to America first, but had finally passed it by. But not here, in the heart of the dream. Here we'd gone on, in a dream logic that knew nothing of pollution, the finite bounds of fossil fuel, or foreign wars it was possible to lose. They were smug, happy, and utterly content with themselves and their world. And in the dream, it was their world. Behind me, the illuminated city. Searchlights swept the sky for the sheer joy of it. I imagined them thronging the plazas of white marble, orderly and alert, their bright eyes shining with enthusiasm for their floodlit avenues and silver cars. It had all the sinister fruitiness of Hitler Youth propaganda. I put the car in gear and drove forward slowly, until the bumper was within 3 feet of them. They still hadn't seen me. I rolled the window down and listened to what the man was saying. His words were bright and hollow as the pitch in some Chamber of Commerce brochure, and I knew that he believed in them absolutely. "John," I heard the woman say, "we've forgotten to take our food bills." She clicked 2 bright wafers from a thing on her belt and passed one to him. I backed onto the highway and headed for Los Angeles, wincing and shaking my head. I phoned Kin from a gas station, a new one, in bad Spanish modern. He was back from his expedition and didn't seem to mind the call. "Yeah, that is a weird one. Did you try to get any pictures? Not that they ever come out, but it adds an interesting frisson to your story, not having the pictures turn out." But what should I do? "Watch lots of television, particularly game shows and soaps. Go to porn movies. Ever seen Nazi Love Motel? They've got it on cable here. Really awful. Just what you need." What was he talking about? "Quit yelling and listen to me. I'm letting you in on a trade secret. Really bad media can exorcise your semiotic ghosts. If it keeps the saucer people off my back, it can keep these Art Deco futuroids off yours. Try it. What have you got to lose?" Then he begged off, pleading an early morning date with the elect. "The who?" "These oldsters from Vegas, the ones with the microwaves." I considered putting a collect call through to London, getting Cohen at Barris Watford and telling him that his photographer was checked out for a protracted season in the Twilight Zone. In the end, I let a machine mix me a really impossible cup of black coffee and climbed back into the Toyota for the haul to Los Angeles. Los Angeles was a bad idea, and I spent 2 weeks there. It was prime Downs country, too much of the dream there, and too many fragments of the dream waiting to snare me. I nearly wrecked the car on a stretch of overpass near Disneyland, when the road fanned out like an origami trick and left me swerving through a dozen mini lanes of whizzing chrome teardrops with shark fins. Even worse, Hollywood was full of people who looked too much like the couple I'd seen in Arizona. I hired an Italian director who was making ends meet doing darkroom work and installing patio decks around swimming pools until his ship came in. He made prints of all the negatives I'd accumulated on the Downs job. I didn't want to look at the stuff myself. It didn't seem to bother Leonardo, though, and when he was finished I checked the prints, rifling through them like a deck of cards, sealed them up, and sent them air freight to London. Then I took a taxi to a theater that was showing Nazi Love Motel and kept my eyes shut all the way. Cohen's congratulatory wire was forwarded to me in San Francisco a week later. Dialta had loved the pictures. He admired the way I'd really gotten into it, and looked forward to working with me again. That afternoon I spotted a flying wing over Castro Street, but there was something tenuous about it, as though it were only half there. I rushed into the nearest newsstand and gathered up as much as I could find on the petroleum crisis and the nuclear energy hazard. I'd just decided to buy a plane ticket for New York. Hell of a world we live in, huh? The proprietor was a thin black man with bad teeth and an obvious wig. I nodded, fishing in my jeans for change, anxious to find a park bench where I could submerge myself in hard evidence of the human near. Sorry. Oh my gosh, that's a long sentence. I nodded, fishing in my jeans for change, anxious to find a park bench where I could submerge myself in hard evidence of the human near dystopia we live in. But it could be worse, huh? That's right, I said. Or even worse, it could be perfect. He watched me as I headed down the street with my little bundle of condensed catastrophe. And that was the Gernsback Continuum by William Gibson. Ooh, the soundtrack could be made of theremins, which I can't do right now because my throat is cracked and dry. It is parched, and my falsetto is gone. My falsetto really is gone. mm, so that was pretty good. 20 minutes? Yeah, why not? I can do fragments of a hologram rose. It's short-ish. Yeah, 6 pages, give or take. One sec, I'm getting another slug of water here. But yeah, you can visually you can imagine a lot of that stuff if you've played any of the Fallout games. There's a lot of that in there. The ray gun gothic, finned things, finned vehicles, little rockets and whatnot, ray guns, literal, actual ray guns, like spaceman ray guns. Um, yeah, that sort of thing. That's what's being discussed. So I think I like that particular story. Fragments of a Hologram Rose is an interesting one. Kind of dark, actually. Alrighty. Sorry about that. Had to take a little yawn due to lack of oxygen hitting the brain and bloodstream. Okay. Fragments of a Hologram Rose by William Gibson. That summer, Parker had trouble sleeping. There were power droughts, sudden failures of the delta inducer brought painfully abrupt returns to consciousness. To avoid these, he used patch cords, miniature alligator clips, and black tape to wire the inducer to a battery-operated ASP deck. Power loss in the inducer would trigger the deck's playback circuit. He bought an ASP cassette that began with the subject asleep on a quiet beach. It had been recorded by a young blonde yogi with 20/20 vision and an abnormally acute color sense. The boy had been flown to Barbados for the sole purpose of taking a nap and his morning's exercise on a brilliant stretch of private beach. The microfiche laminate in the cassette's transparent case explained that the yogi could will himself through alpha to delta without an inducer. Parker, who hadn't been able to sleep without an inducer for 2 years, wondered if this was possible. He had been able to sit through the whole thing only once, though by now he knew every sensation in the first 5 subjective minutes. He thought the most interesting part of the sequence was a slight editing slip at the start of the elaborate breathing routine, a swift glance down the white beach that picked out the figure of a guard patrolling a chain-link fence, a black machine pistol slung over his arm. While Parker slept, power drained from the city's grids. The transition from Delta to Delta ASP was a dark implosion into other flesh. Familiarity cushioned the shock. He felt the cool sand under his shoulders. The cuffs of his tattered jeans flapped against his bare ankles in the morning breeze. Soon the boy would wake fully and begin his Ardha Matsyendra, Ardha Matsyendra, something. Oh, no, sorry. Mangled that. These pages, I swear, are too small for the font. Soon the boy would wake fully and begin his Ardha Matsyendra something. With other hands, Parker groped in darkness for the ASP deck. 3 in the morning. Making yourself a cup of coffee in the dark, using a flashlight when you pour the boiling water. Morning's recorded dream, fading. Through other eyes, dark plume of a Cuban freighter, fading with the horizon it navigates across the mind's gray screen. 3 in the morning. Let yesterday arrange itself around you in flat schematic images. What you said, what she said, watching her pack dialing the cab. However you shuffle them, they form the same printed circuit, hieroglyphs converging on a central component. You, standing in the rain, screaming at the cabbie. The rain was sour and acid, nearly the color of piss. The cabbie called you an asshole. You still had to pay twice the fare. She had 3 pieces of luggage. In his respirator and goggles, the man looked like an ant. He pedaled away in the rain. She didn't look back. The last you saw of her was a giant ant giving you the finger. Parker saw his first ASP unit in a Texas shanty town called Judy's Jungle. It was a massive console cased in cheap plastic chrome. A $10 bill fed into the slot bought you 5 minutes of free fall gymnastics in a Swiss orbital spa, trampolining through 20-meter perihelions with a 16-year-old Vogue model. Heady stuff for the jungle, where it was simpler to buy a gun than a hot bath. He was in New York with forged papers a year later, when 2 leading firms had the first portable decks in major department stores in time for Christmas. The ASP porn theaters that had boomed briefly in California never recovered. Holography went too, and the block-wide Fuller domes that had been the holo temples of Parker's childhood became multi-level supermarkets, or housed dusty amusement arcades where you still might find the old consoles under faded neon pulsing apparent sensory perception through a blue haze of cigarette smoke. Now Parker is 30 and writes continuity for Broadcast ASP, programming the eye movements of the industry's human cameras. The brownout continues. In the bedroom, Parker prods the brushed aluminum face of his Sendai Sleepmaster. Its pilot light flickers, then lapses into darkness. Coffee in hand, he crosses the carpet to the closet she emptied the day before. The flashlight's beam probes the bare shelves for evidence of love, finds a broken leather sandal strap, an ASP cassette, and a postcard. The postcard is a white light reflection hologram of a rose. At the kitchen sink, he feeds the sandal strap to the disposal unit. Sluggish in the brownout, it complains, but swallows and digests. Holding it carefully between thumb and forefinger, he lowers the hologram toward the hidden, rotating jaws. The unit emits a thin scream as steel teeth slash laminated plastic, and the rose is shredded into 1,000 fragments. Later, he sits on the unmade bed, smoking. Her cassette is in the deck, ready for playback. Some women's tapes disorient him, but he doubts this is the reason he now hesitates to start the machine. Roughly a quarter of all ASP users are unable to comfortably assimilate the subjective body picture of the opposite sex. Over the years, some broadcast ASP stars have become increasingly androgynous in an attempt to capture this segment of the audience. But Angela's own tapes have never intimidated him before. But what if she has recorded a lover? No, that can't be it. It's simply that the cassette is an entirely unknown quantity. When Parker was 15, his parents indentured him to the American subsidiary of a Japanese plastics combine. At the time, he felt fortunate. The ratio of applicants to indentured trainees was enormous. For 3 years, he lived with his cadre in a dormitory, singing the company hymns in formation each morning, and usually managing to go over the compound fence at least once a month for girls or the holodrome. The indenture would have terminated on his 20th birthday, leaving him eligible for full employee status. A week before his 19th birthday, with 2 stolen credit cards and a change of clothes, he went over the fence for the last time. He arrived in California 3 days before the chaotic new secessionist regime collapsed. In San Francisco, warring splinter groups hit and ran in the streets. One or another of 4 different provisional city governments had done such an efficient job of stockpiling food that almost none was available at street level. Parker spent the last night of the revolution in a burned out Tucson suburb, making love to a thin teenager from New Jersey, who explained the finer points of her horoscope between bouts of almost silent weeping that seemed to have nothing at all to do with anything he did or said. Years later, he realized that he no longer had any idea of his original motive in breaking his indenture. The first 3 quarters of the cassette have been erased. You punch yourself fast forward through a static haze of wiped tape, where taste and scent blur into a single channel. The audio input is white sound, the no sound of the first dark sea. Prolonged input from wiped tape can induce hypnagogic hallucination. Parker crouched in the roadside New Mexico brush at midnight, watching a tank burn on the highway. Flame lit the broken white line he had followed from Tucson. The explosion had been visible 2 miles away, a white sheet of heat lightning that had turned the pale branches of a bare tree against the night sky into a photographic negative of themselves, carbon branches against magnesium sky. Many of the refugees were armed. Texas owned the shanty towns that steamed in the warm Gulf rains to the uneasy neutrality she had maintained in the face of the coast's attempted secession. The towns were built of plywood, cardboard, plastic sheets that billowed in the wind, and the bodies of dead vehicles. They had names like Jump City and Sugaree, and loosely defined governments and territories that shifted constantly in the covert winds of a black market economy. Federal and state troops sent in to sweep the outlaw towns seldom found anything, but after each search, a few men would fail to report back. Some had sold their weapons and burned their uniforms, and others had come too close to the contraband they had been sent to find. After 3 months, Parker wanted out, but goods were the only safe passage through the army cordons. His chance came only by accident. Late one afternoon, skirting the pall of greasy cooking smoke that hung low over the jungle, he stumbled and nearly fell on the body of a woman in a dry creek bed. Flies rose up in an angry cloud, then settled again, ignoring him. She had a leather jacket, and at night Parker was usually cold. He began to search the creek bed for a length of brushwood. In the jacket's back, just below her left shoulder blade, was a round hole that would have admitted the shaft of a pencil. The jacket's lining had been red once, but now it was black, stiff and shining with dried blood. With the jacket swaying on the end of his stick, he went looking for water. He never washed the jacket. In his left pocket he found nearly an ounce of cocaine, carefully wrapped in plastic and transparent surgical tape.
The right pocket held 15 ampules of megacillin D and a 10-inch horn-handled switchblade. The antibiotic was worth twice its weight in cocaine. He drove the knife hilt deep into a rotten stump passed over by the jungle's wood gatherers and hung the jacket there, the flies circling it as he walked away. That night, in a bar with a corrugated iron roof, waiting for one of the lawyers who worked passages through the cordon, he tried his first ASP machine. It was huge, all chrome and neon, and the owner was very proud of it. He had helped hijack the truck himself. If the chaos of the 90s reflects a radical shift in the paradigms of visual literacy, the final shift away from the Lacoe-Gutenberg tradition of a pre-holographic society, what should we expect from this newer technology, with its promise of discrete encoding and subsequent reconstruction of the full range of sensory perception? Roebuck and Peerhall, Recent American History, A Systems View. Fast forward through the humming no time of wiped tape, into her body, European sunlight, streets of a strange city. Athens, Greek letter signs and the smell of dust. And the smell of dust. Look through her eyes, thinking, this woman hasn't met you yet, you're hardly out of Texas. At the gray monument, horses there in stone, where pigeons whirl up and circle. And static takes love's body, wipes it clean and gray. Waves of white sound break along a beach that isn't there. And the tape ends. The inducer's light is burning now. Parker lies in darkness, recalling the thousand fragments of the hologram rose. A hologram has this quality. Recovered and illuminated, each fragment will reveal the whole image of the rose. Falling toward Delta, he sees himself the rose, each of his scattered fragments revealing a whole he'll never know. Stolen credit cards, a burned out suburb, planetary conjunctions of a stranger, a tank burning on a highway, a flat packet of drugs, a switchblade honed on concrete, thin as pain. Thinking, we're each other's fragments, and was it always this way? That instant of a European trip, deserted in the gray sea of wiped tape. Is she closer now, or more real, for his having been there? She had helped him get his papers, found him his first job in ASP. Was that their history? No, history was the black face of the Delta inducer, the empty closet, and the unmade bed. History was his loathing for the perfect body he woke in if the juice dropped, his fury at the pedal cab driver, and her refusal to look back through the contaminated rain. But each fragment reveals the rose from a different angle, he remembered, but Delta swept over him before he could ask himself what that might mean. And that was Fragments of a Hologram Rose by William Gibson. Kind of dark, maybe is the wrong word. It's more melancholy than dark, but I think that one's pretty rad. Also, you have some of those recurring ideas like Ono Sendai, and as this big conglomerate, you've got, the corp farms and all that stuff. So it's kind of like early era in the sprawl timeline, that the same timeline, or whatever the name of the timeline is that Neuromancer takes place in. Really cool stuff. Hope people have enjoyed that. That is going to do it for me for today. This week. This coming week, I am not going to be able to do my usual Monday or Wednesday, Mecha Monday or Warframe Wednesday streams. I might be able to do my Storytime Saturday stream next Saturday. We will see. Uh, Other than that, hope people are taking it easy. Uh, Depending on where you are, it could be part of a pretty massive, nasty heat wave. Stay safe. Stay well and enjoy life, man. But mostly stay safe and healthy. That's all we can really hope to do. All right, folks, it's been a pleasure. Hope you enjoyed, and have a great week. Bye.